of the languages of God, and I appreciate Carol's note in the bulletin about the title correction, that it's the words of God, languages and translations of the Bible. Although I feel a little bad because I think I made her feel guilty, so I appreciate that. So today I'm going to talk about sources and early translations of the Bible. I promised you the story of Wycliffe, who was burned for heresy after he died, but I don't think I'm going to get there today. So stay tuned to next week. Right, it's the cliffhanger for next week's lesson, although actually I've given the plot. I know, I do that all the time, I give the plot away. At least I wasn't telling a joke and I gave the punchline away beforehand. So for those of you who I don't know, my name is Lynn Santelman. I am a professor of applied linguistics at Portland State University in downtown Portland. One of my areas of interest has always been the history of languages, which is sort of what brought me to this. The other thing that brought me to this is, shall we say, frustration with claims of literal interpretation of the Bible, being a linguist and knowing something about translation and translation theory and how hard it is to translate from one language to another. It's like my brain keeps going, I don't care what your theology is behind that. Literal transmission of the Word of God is impossible, especially once you start translating it. You know, I don't think God spoke Hebrew any more than God speaks English. So that's where I'm coming from. And today my goal is to really talk about how we know what we know about the Bible and where the translations that we have come from. Because I think knowing the history of how these things were passed down can help us interpret what we have and what we have left. But we're going to actually back up a little bit, and we're going to start with a little bit, two short videos that are kind of cute on the history of writing, because the differences between the two writing systems that I'm going to show you are, can I move so that you got it, all right, yes. Oh, you're waving, you're not raising your hand, you're just waving to people. The differences become important for the transmission of the texts. So, and then I will talk about our various sources of biblical manuscripts. The two major sources for the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament and the Old Testament texts, and then the sources that we have for the New Testament, which are mostly come from the original Greek. We have a lot more sources for the New Testament, and then a little bit about St. Jerome's translation of the Bible into the Latin, which became the Latin Vulgate and the most sort of the accepted translation of the Bible for the Western Church. So let's start with a very short tangent into writing. All right, I'm going to make your brains work just a little bit. Who invented our writing system? The Phoenicians, the Egyptians, the Greeks, or the Sumerians? It's not all of the above. All right, so I'm hearing some Phoenicians. You said Phoenicians. The Phoenicians are what we're taught. But the Phoenicians actually picked up and expanded or publicized the Egyptian writing system. I know. See, I feel like we should do like a church trivia night just because people get such pleasure. Well, there is the Super Bible Bowl, except that, the confirmation teachers get really grumpy if the council wins. So that's kind of a rigged game to begin with. Oh yes, the 1 year of the council won, Pat was so mad at me, and she refused to give the council the questions or the topics ahead of time, ever again. So the Egyptian hieroglyphs started off as pictorial representations, very shortly moved to being actually used to stand for the sounds of those words. So if they had a picture of a bird, that became B. The Phoenicians, who were the traders of the regions, picked up on this system and were the ones who spread it throughout the Mediterranean, and that's why we think the Phoenicians invented writing. Now, both the Phoenicians and the Egyptians spoke a Semitic language, and these languages were generally written without any vowels. That works great for the Semitic languages because their words are all based on sort of three consonantal roots, and you can figure out from context what the vowels should be, mostly. It doesn't work great for a language like Greek, where you have endings and suffixes to your words that actually make a big difference. And so the Greeks had to do something about vowels. So that's what we'll see shortly here. All right.
So the craziest thing happened.
All right, we're going to just pretend we don't have any ads.
How did Egyptian hieroglyphs give birth to the alphabet?
Even in these ancient times, Egyptian monuments have been sitting and weathering for thousands of years. On their great murals and pillars, you find rows of little pictures. Sorry, not pictures, hieroglyphs, sacred symbols. But despite appearances, this isn't some mysterious pharaonic picture writing. It's consonants. 1 consonant signs, 2 consonant signs, 3 consonant signs, a wall of consonants, plus a sprinkle of logograph for determinatives. It's not that Egyptian was a harsh, vowelless desert of a tongue. It simply did not write its vowels. Imagine if you wrote this way. Would that work? And then imagine if you could add in logographs to make sure you really got your point across. Imagine you wrote like that, and you're thinking with hieroglyphs. Too difficult? Fine. Off to the caves with you, where you toil away with ancient miners on the Sinai Peninsula. You and your fellow miners would find it handy to leave messages for one another, but there's no time for deep studies of rows of fancy hieroglyphs in here. You need to keep it simple if you want another major moment in the history of writing. Your characters look like scratchy, rushed version of those glamorous Egyptian symbols, but their meaning doesn't matter anymore. Nothing but consonants, and the same symbol for the same consonant every time. Take this character. In Egyptian, it means house. These Semitic miners are calling a house a bet. Acrophony, or top sounds, suggests that you can just take the first letter of a word, like the Egyptians had already been doing with much of their consonant writing. You end up with a letter for your sound, ba. Do the same thing with water, which the Semitic speakers are calling mem, and you now have an sound. With a couple dozen elegant simplifications, you create a simple, reliable list of consonants, an alphabet, and you've given generations of future children the joys of reciting their ABCs. Actually, at this point in history, they're ABGDs, sometimes called an abjad or abgad, because who needs that wishy-washy C when you can just use an S or a K? After a long, hard day of mining and etching, you turn to find that someone's been watching you this whole time. She's a traitor, a Phoenician merchant who knows a good thing when she sees it. She's already made major cash in the paper business, where they turn tufty, stocky, swampy Egyptian papyrus into flat, inkable sheets of paper. She rushes back home to Phoenicia and smirks. Think of the advantage she has, keeping track of whatever anyone else tells her just by remembering about as many characters as she has fingers and toes. Old kings can keep their obtuse hieroglyphs and their stone monuments. The future of the Mediterranean will belong to alphabets and paper. Writing is going portable. She uses this newfound alphabetic leverage to turn a huge profit across the entire eastern Mediterranean, leaving people inspired to adopt and adapt her alphabet wherever she goes. All this, and she doesn't even write you a thank you card? How hard could it be? Writing is easier than ever. It feels universal, like writing's here to stay, for everyone. But there's a peculiar quirk that's easier to spot in hindsight. You and your mining crew communicating in a Semitic language. Phoenician's a Semitic language. All of these friendly shades of the Phoenician alphabet were being used for languages that sounded similar and worked much the same way. Even Egyptian, though no Semitic language itself, is at least a distant relative of the Semitic languages with a similar personality. This consonant alphabet is being tested in easy waters, but history is shaking things up. Your merchant friend comes back for your help. She needs you to deliver your alphabet to a very different people living along her trade route. What will happen when the alphabet gets leaked outside of the family?
That's part 2.
Once upon a time, people wrote this way. You couldn't even buy a vowel. Someone had to invent them. It might have happened something like this.
Greece. No, not that Greece. Greece before there was a Parthenon. A stern old man in a trademark sporty toga seems a bit on edge as he glares at the papyrus sheet clutched in his hand. Ah, you see? You try to shrug off his outburst, but he can't let this go. My friend, my friend! He recounts how 500 years before he was even born, when the walls of Troy still stood, the Greeks had a writing system of their own. It was one of those more elaborate syllabary plus logograph types, but that script had come and it had gone. The new Greeks were a people on the rise, but an illiterate people on the rise. A people looking for something new, something great. And this alphabet thing seems great. Almost. He calls over his close friends. The Phoenician consonants are useful, he concedes, but why these extra characters for huffing, coughing, and clearing your throat? These are barbarian sounds. Greeks have no need for them. And what about the voicey noises like ah and ooh? How to write them, huh? So much extra, yet so much missing. What a mess. You try to explain, but they laugh it off. Here, I fix for you, he says. See, he was going to ditch the barbarian letters, but he had second thoughts, and it struck him. Why not use these un-Greek sounds for vowels? The one you call aleph, ignore the throaty catch at the beginning. It's ah. Take that hey, but ditch the huh, and we're left with a vowel-y eh. Loosen up that tight wa in wow, and it's the vowel ooh. This isn't just a small correction. This is a powerful major moment in the history of writing. He's fundamentally shifted the way the alphabet functions. It used to be just the consonant suggesting the pronunciation of a word. Once you recognize the word, the job's done. But Greek spelling isn't merely about writing recognizable words. It's about matching letters to sounds. A new principle has just emerged. Perhaps even a new goal. One sound, one character. You suspect that he's not even aware of the impact of his discovery as he tells you to drop everything and come enjoy some dinner and dancing. It'd be silly. The party goes on, so long that your new friends don't even see what's happening beyond the walls of their cityscape. This consonant vowel alphabet, this pronunciation writing is spreading, inspiring new alphabets to the east, with flavors like Armenian and Cyrillic popping up. Out west in Italy, the Tuscans, the Etruscans, borrow it, and they pass it on to the Romans. The Romans burst out and splatter it among the Celts and Germanic peoples, and eventually the world. Such a visual rainbow of variations, and yet they'll all stick with the basic principle of writing a character for each sound, consonants and vowels. Finally, you see your writing system in this story, your alphabet, all because a handful of Semitic symbols got mistaken for Greek vowels. But before you get overconfident, know that the history of writing doesn't stop here. This isn't the be-all and end-all, not even close.
But we're not going to go any further with this. So just a little bit about writing and literacy. Writing a complex document like the Bible requires significant literacy skills. You can't just write down anything. One of the things that we know about writing is it's actually very different from our spoken language. Writing and the spoken language are really two different things, which is why kids often get frustrated in the early stages of learning how to write, because they want it to sound like the books they're reading, and what they're able to produce sounds more like a 3-year-old. They don't have the words, they don't have the letters, they don't have even the muscle strength to be able to write it. And we know that the priests and the scribes in the early Jewish communities and all the way up through Jesus' time had to have been literate. After all, the whole word scribe means to write. And so obviously there were classes of people within these societies who knew how to write. There's some evidence from graffiti and writing on pots that there was some literacy among the non-scribe people of Judah. But it probably wasn't very widespread. People, when they learned the Torah, it was probably done much like learning the Quran is today, where they memorize large sections of it, rather than actually reading it out loud. So widespread literacy was unlikely. Actually, widespread literacy was really uncommon until after the Reformation, and really didn't come into being until the late 18th century, 19th century, really, where you had more and more people becoming literate, and even into the early 20th century. Most people were literate, but there was a significant population in industrializing nations that was not literate. What this means is that, what does this mean? I love it when I don't finish a thought on my slides. What this means is actually that we have, because literacy was not widespread, people didn't have bookshelves in their houses, so we don't have a lot of different sources for these particular documents. The sources that we have for the Hebrew Old Testament and then the New Testament, usually they would be, books that were in a synagogue. Maybe some of the rabbis would have them, but most people didn't own books. So already the number of possible books that you would have in a society is relatively small. And then when you add sort of political upheavals and things getting lost, et cetera, there weren't that many to pass down to subsequent generations. All right, let me move back just a little bit so I hate not being able to see my students. Yes, are you sneaking up on me and saying awful things? No, or are you photobombing my course? So, sources for these translations. In addition to the fact that not many people were literate, according to Jewish law, sacred texts and really anything that has the name of God in it can't be thrown out. You just can't throw a book in the trash. You can't just recycle it. They have to be buried respectfully. And these were generally placed in what's called I think it's pronounced Geniza, who knows how it's actually stressed, which is sort of a storage chamber under the temple, and then when they got enough of them, they would go bury them. Parchment, which was usually written on vellum or animal skin, and papyrus and other writing materials of the age don't age well over time. And then we have the Jewish diasporas. They are sort of at the crossroads of the Mediterranean, and they kept getting invaded and run over by people, the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the Greeks and the Romans. And every time somebody overran them, a few more people were lost to various areas, and they carried some of them with them, but also, their homes and their synagogues and their materials got destroyed. So because of this tradition of not keeping or not sort of throwing out, that once a Torah got used up, it had to be buried. Not many of those remain. And you add into sort of the fragility of the paper or of the materials and these diasporas, you don't get a whole lot of texts that are left. So for the earliest periods, for a long time, the two major sources of the Old Testament were what are known as the Masoretic texts, and I'll explain what that is in just a minute, as well as the Septuagint, which is actually a Greek translation of the Bible. More recently, with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in the mid-20th century, and they're finally being published and translated these days, it took them a good, 30 years, I think, to start making some of these things public. And to piece together the manuscripts, because you had all these tiny little pieces sometimes they had to figure out. It's sort of like a major jigsaw puzzle where you might have like 150 puzzles mixed together and you can't tell what goes with what. All of these fragmentary things. So, all right, but to introduce the Masoretic texts, I'm going to give you a couple minutes to tell me what the words of this psalm are. Oh, all right. Go, Mary. For my days pass away like smoke. And my bones burn like a furnace. You guys are good. My heart is stricken and withered like grass.
Empty, wasted.
All right. Right. That's actually I am.
Oh, that's I.
Well, there's no I there because we don't have any vowels. Because of my groaning, loud groaning, my bones cling to my skin. I am like a desert. Ooh. Not a wolf. Owl of the wilderness. Like a little owl of the waste places. There you go. My heart is stricken and withered like a grass. I am too wasted to eat my bread. To eat my bread. That's the only one y'all couldn't get. But so, if you notice, this is how the Jewish texts, the Hebrew texts are written, even today, and Arabic and all these other languages. They don't have the vowels. So there were places where it was, okay, it was clear, okay, and my bones burn like, okay, furnace might actually have been an easy one to get because of all the consonants, and then you kind of had to go backwards. You had to work out from context a lot, didn't you? What was what? And we can do it. We don't actually need vowels, but they're really helpful for certain words like I and am, and these other linking things. I will give you some examples next week of some Old English translations of the Bible. And you will see there that actually they do make a difference because in Old English, the vowels could tell you who was doing what to whom. And that's kind of important. Is it like, am I smiting God or is God smiting me? Is probably a distinction we want to figure out. So the Masoretic texts, these are Hebrew texts that are the basis of all of the current authoritative versions of the Hebrew Bible. And the original versions, they were sort of a codification of all of the Hebrew texts. They began mostly in the 1st century CE. All right, now this is, for some of you who went to school a long time ago, CE might not be a familiar acronym. Common Era, otherwise known as AD. So we now talk about BCE, before the Common Era, and CE, the Common Era. BCE is obviously BC. CE is you can translate that in your brain as AD. It actually makes more sense for English speakers because nobody knows what AD stands for. Anno Domini, you're right. But I mean, unless you speak Latin, that doesn't really help you much. And since since we're good, Lutherans, we don't teach Latin in our schools or our Sunday schools. Around the 10th century, so sometime in the 900s, the Masoretes realized that reading these Hebrew texts was kind of hard. Because remember, in the Jewish synagogue, the Torah is chanted out loud at every service. And let's just say mistakes were creeping in. And so they began to add vowel markings. They began to do things like paragraphs. If you look at early writing, it's just one continuous stream. There is no paragraphs. Often there's no punctuation. There's no word breaks sometimes. And so it's very hard to figure out where one word stops and another word starts. And so to aid in reading and understanding, they added these reading notes and the vowel notes and the punctuation. Mary? The Masoretes are, it was a Jewish sect, more or less. And I don't remember where they lived. I suspect, do you know where they lived, Jim?
They would have started in the earliest generations, probably in Galilee after the temple was destroyed and the city was destroyed the second time.
Right.
They were forced out, and then.
Right. So they would have started in Galilee. I'm just repeating this for those of you who may not hear. After the fall of the second fall of the temple, or the fall of the second temple. There we go. What's the order? I needed to get it in. Their job was basically preserving some of these writings, and that's what they have taken on as their task. The two oldest complete versions that we have of the Hebrew Bible are the Aleppo Codex. So that was taken off to Aleppo, Spain, these codexes, these manuscripts were very closely guarded by the Jewish communities that they were in. They did not let outsiders come in and see them. So it really is not until modern times that modern biblical scholars were able to see a lot of these texts. Unfortunately, the Aleppo Codex, which was written in 925, was partially burned in 1947, and I think about a third of it was destroyed. So the only complete codex we have now is known as the Leningrad Codex, which was written about 175 years later. These two texts, one of the things that the Masoretes did is they were very careful about transmission. And so they went through and every time somebody writes a manuscript, copies of manuscript, you get little copy errors in there. They were very careful about going through and eliminating copy errors and things like that. So these two texts are virtually identical. So that we have at least some copies of this, and as I said, they're the basis of the current Jewish texts that are used in synagogues. As a sort of an interesting aside, so I noted that these manuscripts, once they were worn out, were put in the Geniza, and then saved for burial. In the Ben Ezra synagogue in Cairo, in sort of Victorian times, they discovered a huge collection of manuscripts. I think it was about 200,000 documents and other manuscripts. Actually, 400,000. It was, and these contained a lot. They contained liturgical texts, biblical texts, rabbinical literature, legal documents, private letters, anything that might contain the name of God, and it got tossed in there, but they were actually never buried. About half of these texts were, as far as I can tell, basically taken away by tourists. People would come and kind of take something out of there. I know, and spread out. And then scholars from Cambridge University eventually convinced the synagogue to let them have the rest. And so most of the rest are at Cambridge University. But this is what they looked like. So, you don't have, these were worn out texts. You don't have people trying to preserve them because they were worn out and they were going to be buried. So it's been a huge task to kind of try to pin together some of these things. And the parts that they have are actually some very close to the Masoretic texts. we have documents written in Hebrew and in Aramaic and in Arabic, and there's a tiny bit of Greek thrown in there too, I think. And most of these are from the 11th to the 19th centuries. And so they're really useful as a source of information about Jewish texts and Jewish life in this particular period, and they can back up some of these things.
Aren't they using AI now?
They are. The advent of AI and the advent of like the ability to scan inside some of these documents and detect the print has made it somewhat easier to figure out what these letters are, because you don't have to break apart these manuscripts that are all folded up or rolled up together. Sometimes you can get the information without actually unrolling it and breaking it apart, which is a problem. It also contains some very early Christian texts, but not too terribly many. You probably have all heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls. I had to resist the urge to do like a whole day on the Dead Sea Scrolls, so this is, why not? Because I only have 4 weeks, and while they're really cool, there are other things I wanted to cover. That's the perpetual, problem of a teacher. When I began teaching the history of English, I had to resist the urge to go through the entire evolution of humankind before I got to English. It's like, I think this is really cool, but perhaps not. My students don't actually need to know about evolution from Lucy all the way up through the human.
What about Nag Hammadi? That's some old writings they found.
They have found, the Dead Sea Scrolls were kind of the first, and since then they have found writings all around that particular region. And so I'm going to restrict it to the Dead Sea Scrolls here because there's only so much time we've got. These were discovered in 11 caves near Qumran, which was then in Jordan. After the 6 Days War, it became part of Israel. And they were excavated between 1947 and 1956. Once they were discovered, there was sort of a race on between the local Bedouin shepherds and the scholars to see who could find what first, because they were worth some money, and so the local peoples wanted in on that action. So Qumran there is at the northwest edge of the Dead Sea, and there are other locations on there where you can see where they have had subsequent finds kind of all around there. There's some debate as to who wrote these. The most common theory is that they were written by a Jewish sect called the Essenes, who were actually in this region, and there's some evidence that this wasn't just sort of a community, they actually sort of had biblical transcription workshops there. There were people who were making, the ends of the scrolls, and there were people who were making the scrolls, and there were people who were writing them. And they placed them in the caves most likely during the Great Jewish Revolt. Let's see there, I'm using AD, 66 to 73 AD. I don't always catch myself. And that they, when the Romans were sending the Jews out and persecuting the Jews, and they had to get rid of stuff and flee. Some may actually have been placed deliberately in storage. The last bits were kind of, placed in a heap, and we hope they we're leaving town. These texts date from the 3rd century before Christ to the 1st century after. So they are now our oldest written texts about this. This is what one of the caves looks like. This is the infamous Cave 4, which has the most manuscript pieces as part of it. So if you notice, it's this little cave high up in the wall there. And so they weren't terribly easily accessible. But once, this is very common of caves in that region. And so once they found out that there were things in these caves, they began exploring to find other caves and other things. 981 different manuscripts have been identified. That doesn't mean we have complete manuscripts, which means we have at least pieces of that many. They're written in Hebrew and Aramaic and a little Greek. About 40% are copies of Hebrew scriptures that are still considered part of the Hebrew canon. About 30% are texts from the Second Temple period that did not make it into the Hebrew canonical Bible. And the remainder are sort of secular texts. So one of the things this tells you is already that, okay, if 30% of these texts are sort of holy writings that were of that time, and they didn't make it into the canon, that means already starting in the 1st and 2nd century, we had people winnowing out what was approved scripture and what was not approved scripture. This is one of those things that makes me think, okay, so, yes, maybe it was divinely inspired, but there was the work of humans in there too, in terms of deciding whose voice got to be heard. And anytime you establish a canon like that, one of the questions that's asked is, okay, that you need to ask is, who is directing this and whose voice wants to be heard and whose voice is not being heard in these texts? This is a sample of a scroll fragment. This is actually a pretty well-preserved scroll fragment. It's partly connected, but it describes events that didn't make it into our Bible. It describes apocalyptic, there we go, I can say that word, confrontation between the righteous and the observant sons of light and the sinful and disobedient sons of darkness. This would be considered a heresy in modern religious circles, I believe. They sort of, which include traditional biblical enemies, as well as some more traditional Jewish groups that were considered violators of the covenant. So you can see that already there's a little political opinion here, sort of like the New Testament really doesn't like the Pharisees and the Sadducees. That was not an uncommon thing in that particular time. All right, so the last thing I'll talk about today is some of these histories of Bible translations. So the earliest translations of the Old Testament are the Targums, or actually, if you wanted to give it the Hebrew name, the Targumim. These were translations of the Hebrew Bible into Aramaic, because most people were no longer speaking Aramaic or speaking Hebrew, and so they needed it translated into the vernacular. The Septuagint, which was translated into Greek, and was completed between the 2nd century BCE and the 4th century CE, so it's got a long period there. We also have Coptic translations that were into the 3rd or 4th century CE, so those were languages spoken in Egypt mostly. And then also Syriac, which is a Semitic language, which again is about the 5th century CE. And all of these can sort of be sources, or these are our early translations of the Bible. The Targums, they actually were originally only supposed to be spoken, but they would read parts of the Hebrew Bible, and then because nobody understood it, someone standing next to them would stand there and translate it for them. And often, not only would they translate it, they would give a little commentary as they were translating. We can never resist doing that. So this is what one of the manuscripts look like. If you notice, it looks just like a Hebrew text with the Hebrew letters. It's because they were written with the same letters. But if you actually know those languages, you can tell the difference. And so the earliest written forms were Aramaic translations of the Bible. They form now part of the traditional Jewish literature, not necessarily always sacred literature. And that's because they included commentary and interpretations. Actually, parts of the Old Testament Targums were found in the Dead Sea Scrolls that date to about a century BCE. There are evidence of written Targums of the Pentateuch and the prophets from as early as the 3rd century in this era. Later versions were edited in Babylonia, and those were the ones that have been passed down among generations. There was also a Palestinian, sort of two tracks, one from Palestine and one from Babylonia, for the passing down of these manuscripts. And the evidence is that they were written by fairly learned people. These were people who were well-versed in Hebrew and Aramaic and had an education in explaining the Bible and in Jewish interpretation. The Septuagint, which is important for us, and we'll see more with Martin Luther, or sometimes abbreviated LXX in the favorite Roman numeral system. is the earliest Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. There are a couple of legends of its origins. I like the first one best. It's absolutely probably not true, but I love it anyways. That 72 translators worked independently on translating the Hebrew Bible into Greek, and after they were all done, they came up with identical versions. Exactly, yeah, no. It's a lovely legend and it makes no sense. That ain't happening. Another, perhaps more plausible, is that King Ptolemy of Egypt, the second of Egypt, commissioned a translation for the library in Alexandria. The truth is probably Greek was the language, lingua franca of the region, and they needed versions in Greek in order for all of their people to be able to understand it. And so there isn't a single author, a single person. The analysis of the language suggests that it began to be translated as early as the 3rd century BCE, and the rest of the Old Testament probably about a century later. That's what a Septuagint manuscript looks like. It's important for later translations because the early Christian church used the Septuagint as the basis of their Old Testament, and they also kind of went through it and said, oh yeah, there's a prophecy that was fulfilled by Christ. There's a prophecy that was fulfilled by Christ. The Jews, unsurprisingly, didn't really approve of this use of their Bible. And so they actually quit using Septuagint and went back to the Masoretic text and only the Hebrew. And from there, when we have these kind of two separate traditions that led into our current Bible, one from the Hebrew tradition and one then from these Greek translations. And so it's the basis of most of the other translations of the Old Testament in the Christian traditions, from Old Latin to Coptic to Old Church Slavonic, which is the precursor to a lot of the Slavic languages. St. Jerome used this to begin his translation of the Vulgate into, into English, into Latin in 382 CE. He actually went back eventually to the Hebrew text, but this was his starting spot. So the sources for the Old Testament are the Septuagint and these Masoretic texts and the Dead Sea Scrolls. Those are the current sources. As we learn more from the Dead Sea Scrolls, we're starting to update our modern translations of the Bible. So my husband, who's next door teaching about David, one of the things that has changed is how tall Goliath was. Fortunately, Goliath shrank. He's still tall, but he's not as tall as he was. You'll have to ask Paul that. The current translations of the Old Testament, because there are differences between the Hebrew texts and the Septuagint, we know that there are differences. We know also that there was very careful transmission of the Masoretic text because that was part of their copying tradition. The Septuagint doesn't have as neat a history. It was compiled from a lot of different Greek translations. It's also not so much a word-by-word translation, but a concept-by-concept translation. There's also a lot of copy errors in it, and people have gone through and tried to clean it up. It's helpful because it is one of the early translations, but it probably shouldn't be the only source, and that's indeed, seminarians these days have to learn something about Hebrew and something about Greek, not just Greek, in order to be able to understand these translations. But it's also really helpful for understanding how peoples of that time understood the Hebrew Bible. Because they were translating concept by concept rather than word by word, you get information about sort of how they were interpreting things. How do they interpret some of these metaphors, those kinds of things.
Can you give an example of a concept by concept? So, for example, if I were to say something like, that was really well done, you hit a home run. And then I needed to translate that into another language. I would probably not use the phrase hit a home run because that is a phrase that's unique to our culture and our language. I would say something like that was very successful. And you're going to get a lot more of this next week, because this is where the linguistics and the translation theory comes in. So you don't worry, you may even get to practice on your own. Sources for New Testament translations are all in Greek. The earliest sources are from about the 2nd and 3rd century CE, but most are partial copies. Not, we don't have the original translation of the Gospel of Matthew or the Gospel of Mark. We have copies of that, and often partial copies. We have more manuscripts that were written on parchment or vellum, and these are mostly from the 4th and 5th centuries. They're from the 12th to 15th centuries. We actually have even more complete manuscripts, over 5,000 copies of either parts of it or full manuscripts. So overall, we have about 6,000 Greek manuscripts that are sources for the New Testament. Not all of these agree because of some of these copy errors, but they're fairly similar. And like with the Hebrew canon, there are a few Gospels that didn't make it in, like the Gospel of Thomas, some other things that didn't make it there. So here is an example of a 3rd century papyrus fragment of the Acts of the Apostles, and you can tell, it looks like it's ready to fall apart at any time. Here is a 4th century Greek manuscript of the book of Esther, which is on parchment or vellum. And then an 11th century copy of the Gospels in Greek on parchment. So the earliest translations of the New Testament were Syriac, Latin, and Coptic in the 1st and 2nd centuries. We have 3rd to 5th century translations from Gothic, which is a Germanic language. If you remember the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths and the people who sacked Rome, it's those people. Actually, my PhD advisor in graduate school did his dissertation on Gothic and the Gothic Bible. He used to joke that he had a Goth chained in his basement, and that's how he got his data. Armenian, Georgian, Ethiopian, Persian. So you can kind of see the lands to which these Gospels were being spread. Later translations into Arabic, Nubian. So we're going sort of west into North Africa here. Also Church Slavonic, northeast into the Slavic countries. And then we have some translations of the Latin Vulgate, which is St. Jerome's copy, an Old English translation from the 9th, 10th century, Old French, Old High German, Old Low German, so all of these sort of historical European languages as well. All right, so the last thing I'll tell you today is about St. Jerome. He was commissioned by the Pope of the time, Pope Damasus. Damasus? I don't know how to pronounce his name. I will call him Damasus because Damasus sounds worse. To revise or retranslate the Bible. At the time, they were using sort of a collection of texts called the Vetus Latina that sort of had been translated by various people from Greek into Latin of the time. The Eastern Church was still using Greek, and Greek was still widely spoken there, but the Western Church people were speaking Latin, and they didn't understand these Greek texts. He started with the Septuagint and the Greek New Testament, and then realized, I think I really need the Hebrew. There was also a change in popes, and he moved to Bethlehem and completed his translation work there. He also noted some differences between the Hebrew text and the Septuagint, namely what we now call the apocryphal books. Now, the Catholic Church still includes the apocryphal books because its translations were based on the Septuagint. But because he went back to the Hebrew, he said, I'm not so sure about these books. It took him about 40 years to do the complete translation. And at the end of the 40 years, he came up with then what the Latin Vulgate, which then over time became the official version of the Catholic Church. A comparison of the two, if you just look at them, even if you don't speak Latin, you can see little differences between the two. So this is the story of where Jesus' disciples went through the fields of grain and were eating fields of grain on the Sabbath, and the Pharisees didn't like that. And I did just a little bit of a translation. So in the Vetus Latina, the older documents, it was when he went among the crops. And in the Latin Vulgate, it was when he was passing through the fields of grain. So it's a slightly more fluent translation and some small differences in words. Actually, some bits of the Vetus Latina remain in church use. So Gloria in Excelsis Deo does not actually occur in the Latin Vulgate. But gosh, we recognize that from some of our hymns, don't we? We wouldn't have Christmas carols. You know, Gloria in Altissimus Deo doesn't have the same ring to it. Now, if we'd grown up with Gloria in Altissimus Deo, you know, glory to God in the highest, there's also some grammatical differences there too. And on earth, peace to men of goodwill, and I don't remember Pax. I don't remember what the other difference is because I don't do Latin. All right, so I'll conclude with true or false. The Catholic Church banned translations of the Bible into the vernacular.
That's probably true in the beginning.
False. It banned unauthorized translations. And that's where we'll pick up next week. All right, thank you, everybody.